So we'll get started with Jim Moulthrup. Currently, he is the Executive Director of FP2 Incorporated, a nonprofit trade association representing the pavement preservation industry.
Good morning. So the things I'm going to cover, a little caveat, then look at the U.S. DOT, the U.S. Congress in terms of the House of Representatives and the Senate. I'll look at the committees in both of those situations and then make some closing comments. From the caveat point of view, this presentation was prepared in late October. Todd wanted me to send it to him by November 1st, which was about 5 days or so before the election. So naturally, you'll see here that the elections were yesterday, as most of you know. I could have stayed up all night, as I said, and revised this presentation, but I didn't. So what I have to say is going to be my best to lay out the situation, whoever happens to be in power in the U.S. Congress coming ahead. So the makeup of the congressional committees, regardless of the outcome of the election, substantial changes in leadership are going to occur in both the House and the Senate, and I'll tell you why in a minute or so. Chairman Schuster from Pennsylvania is retiring. He elected not to run again. He's been a very, very active chair of the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, was very, very effective in getting the FAA bill passed, which had been languishing for years in the House and Senate, but that finally was passed. So he's been a very active person, and if you remember it all, his father was also the chair of this committee for a number of years and very active in a lot of the legislation that took place. If control is not changed, which I understand from looking at one email this morning, it has, which indicated that at a 65% chance that the House is going Democrat instead of Republican, but I don't know the latest. However, since Schuster is retiring, that would mean that either Representative Graves from Missouri, he's from, I think, in the St. Joe area, northwestern Missouri, or Representative Denham from California, who is from the Central Valley, would be the chair of that T&I committee. If in fact it turned out to be Democratic, then Representative DeFazio from Oregon will be the chair, which would mean that if in fact the Republicans kept control of the House, DeFazio would be the ranking member, which is the terminology that's used to indicate most highest power person in the party that's not in power. So the ranking member is the highest guy in that thing. So it's most likely that Graves or Denham will be the ranking member if the Democrats take control of the House. In the Senate, again, depending on the election outcome, some changes in leadership may take place. They don't necessarily have to. But you see here, Senator Barrasso from Wyoming would continue to be chair if the Republicans control the Senate. And if it changes, Senator Carper from Delaware will become chair. Senator Carper has been involved with the Environmental and Public Works Committee with the Senate for a long, long time and is a very large advocate of pavements and transportation issues. So there's nothing to be lost in terms of what the Senate's all about. So let's look a little bit more at the House Transportation Infrastructure Committee. Both Graves and Denham, as you see here, have been involved in that committee for a long time. As a matter of fact, Graves was maybe the chair of the Highways and Transportation Subcommittee, and Denham is a longtime member of that subcommittee. Fazio has been a veteran transportation person, serving on that committee since his first term in 1986. So he's been in Washington for a long, long time and is quite an advocate of preservation, as I'll describe here in a minute. They have a long tradition of being very bipartisan. If you follow at all anything in the news, you know that bipartisan is kind of an unusual term to be used about Washington these days. Doesn't seem to happen very often, but the T&I committee has historically been very bipartisan in terms of passing any legislation related to transportation infrastructure. Schuster put out a kind of a feeler, if you will, earlier this year on the discussion draft to start people thinking about ideas what should be included in the next transportation bill. I can tell you that both the House and the Senate have been working on transportation legislation for the last 2 years. We've been meeting periodically with them over that period of time, and we know that they're working on something. They're not at liberty to tell us exactly what might be in the bill and what might not be in the bill, but we do know there's been a lot of work already underway in terms of what's going to eventually occur. So there were 4 areas in Schuster's draft, if you will. First of all, the Highway Trust Fund. I think most of you realize that it is one of the true lockboxes in the federal government in the U.S., meaning that if you pay a user fee, sometimes called a gas tax, put automobile fuel or diesel or whatever, that money, that tax money actually goes into a restricted box. It's strictly for transportation areas. It's not something that can be used for Social Security or health care or whatever. It's strictly designated for infrastructure and transportation uses. So the problem with it, it's based on gas tax, which, as most of you know, the advent of autonomous vehicles and electric cars and so on and so forth means that revenue stream that had been coming into that fund for a long time is no longer at the level that it used to be. And it's probably not going to get any better with time, just because of the innovations that have been made in the industry. So how do we take care of this lockbox to make sure that the funding continues on a needed basis? So his idea is to reform that Highway Trust Fund in some way, shape, or form. As in most discussion drafts, there's no details. Always the devil's in the details, of course. But nonetheless, the idea is to keep the Highway Trust Fund in good shape. Also, to strengthen thoughtful investments in things like pavement preservation. That was clear in his draft as well, which is, from our industry point of view, is very good. Thirdly, innovative financing, bonds or some other mechanism that in fact would allow financing, whether it be 3P projects or whatever, as we go along. And accelerating project delivery. That's been a kind of a key word probably in the last 3 or 4 legislative areas like MAP 21 or the FAST Act. There's always been the talk of accelerating project delivery. Some changes have been made in regulations, I'm sure you're aware, that had been out there regarding time for project review and plans review and environmental situations and so forth. That's been shortcut quite a bit recently. So project delivery acceleration has always been a very needed thing. His proposal for the Highway Trust Fund is to increase the user fee or gas tax by 15 cents and to index it so it keeps track of inflation, and diesel by 20%. Then develop some kind of a revenue model for that the Highway Trust Fund Commission, as he sees it being developed, which will develop a new funding mechanism to be put in place by 2028. The whole idea there, of course, is to address the issue of autonomous vehicles, electric cars, etc. He thinks, in his draft, that this will primarily be based on vehicle miles traveled. Now, some of you are probably aware that's always a contentious issue about privacy, even though I suspect that most of everybody in this room has a cell phone, and probably AT&T or Verizon knows exactly where you are right now. So the whole idea of privacy with VMT is kind of an issue that maybe doesn't hold as much water as a lot of people would like to think it is, but nonetheless, that is an issue, and it remains to be seen how it works out. DeFazio, on the other hand, from Oregon, is a straight shooter, and he's been very critical of the current administration's lack of commitment for infrastructure. If you remember during the 2016 presidential election and campaign, there was a lot of talk about infrastructure and how much money and so on and so forth. After the election took place, it was kind of in vogue to talk about it again. And then all the oxygen kind of got sucked out of Washington with a number of issues, the Supreme Court, nomination and a lot of other things that happened, all of a sudden transportation and infrastructure kind of fell, on the back burner. Because of that, DeFazio has been pretty critical of the administration and felt that something needs to be done. In fact, last year he introduced a bill called Investing in America, a penny for progress. And in that bill, he would increase the gas tax also on diesel and kerosene at 1.5 cents a year over a period of time. The government would issue 30-year bonds, investment bonds through 2030, and that the revenue from those bonds would then transfer to the Highway Trust Fund to stabilize it. That's his vision of how it would work. You'll notice in that second bullet the term state of good repair. That's kind of an interesting term, but it's in the FAST Act. It's in the law, state of good repair. And there is a pavement preservation expert task group with Federal Highway Administration, and we've long discussed what exactly does that mean. Nobody seems to have a pretty good idea of what state of good repair is. Nonetheless, that's his proposal that would be in that act. It's interestingly, it's widely supported by industry. The trucking industry, a lot of the other industries involved are very much in favor of that bill. He also backed the Democratic proposal of late 2016 called A Better Deal to Rebuild America. And there are lots of details of what was in that. If DeFazio is chair, and it looks like he will be, it looks like something will happen and he will introduce something to that effect. All this will take place in January because the committee assignments, depending on who won, the committee assignments will take place in late November, early December, and then the chair will be selected, and then work will actually begin when the next Congress is seated in January. The Senate, the Environmental and Public Works Committee, they either Barrasso or Carper will chair the committee and begin the process, as I said, of drafting the authorization, addressing as well the Highway Trust Fund shortfall. Remains to be seen about how that's going to work out. The House typically is a lot more transparent about what they're working on. The Senate is a lot more cautious about letting any leaks or details emerge about what are some of the things involved. Interestingly enough, some of people that that I know, have been detailed to the Environmental Public Works Committee from Federal Highway to work on legislation. So it's very, very good from a pavement preservation point of view that most likely nothing will happen in terms of policy related to pavement preservation that was first in the MAP 21 Act. That will not be eliminated. So that's good news for us. Interestingly enough, the composition of the Senate gives more power to rural areas. I'm sure that unless you've been in a cave for a while, you know that one of the issues has been, why does Rhode Island have 2 senators and California only has 2? Population of California is close to 40 million or whatever, and Rhode Island might be 15. I'm not sure if that's true, but Wyoming as well. Wyoming, I think, has 600 or 6,000, well, I forget, it doesn't make any difference. A very small state, a very small population, but they have 2 senators. So one of the issues is, well, is that fair or not, recently in the news. But in fact, it does provide more power in rural areas, especially for Barrasso in Wyoming. So that's kind of the makeup of the committee as we see it right now. Remains to be seen how it all pans out, but that's pretty much what's going to happen. There will be changes made in all of the leadership positions in both the House and the Senate. I think it bodes pretty well for transportation legislation, but the fact is that I couldn't be more informative, but whoever controls Congress, regardless if it's the Democrats or the Republicans, have several things in front of them. The FAST Act expires in 2020. That's about 18 months from now. That's the current legislation that allows infrastructure and transportation legislation to take place, money to flow, and so on and so forth. It expires in 2020. It was a 5-year bill, which was unusual at the time because most of the transportation bills up until then have been pretty much kicked the can down the road, reauthorize it, the existing bill, and let it keep rolling along. This bill actually was 5 years in duration, but 5 years is a fairly short time in the legislative picture, so it expires. And secondly, the Highway Trust Fund will be depleted in 2022. So if spending continues in that lockbox as it has now, by 2022, there won't be any money left in it. So something has to be done in terms of funding, infrastructure, and transportation. Things have already transpired to a certain extent, but certainly as the new committees get situated, new leadership takes place, or continues in the Senate, then real serious work on transportation legislation, in fact, will occur. We expect it to be a very key issue in 2019, but we said the same thing in 2017. So it remains to be seen how much transportation legislation gets to the forefront in terms of what's actually going to happen. We expect pavement preservation to not be an issue, regardless of what happens and who's in charge. We see that it will build on MAP 21 legislation, which specifically used FHWA's definition of pavement preservation in the law. And as a result, it's in the statute. And when the FAST Act was passed, the policy part of what was in MAP 21 wasn't changed. So we don't expect that to have any impact on the business area that we're involved with. At any rate, sorry I couldn't be a little more definitive for you, but I'll be glad to take any questions that you might have. I'm not sure I have any answers, but you can ask the question. One thing I forgot to mention for those of you in the room, one of the things that FP2 does is we have a Sorensen Award. You may have heard yesterday Colin Durante mention Jim Sorensen, who was the construction and maintenance engineer with FHWA for a long time in Washington, a very large advocate of our business area. At any rate, after he passed away, we decided to name an award for him to give to a city, county, state DOT who has a very elegant, extensive pavement preservation program. The last couple of years, we haven't had any nominations. So if you know of a city, county, or state DOT that would fit that category, if you go to our website, fp2.org, there are the criteria associated with that award. Would be glad to consider it. So give that some attention, especially those of you in industry itself, and not so much the DOTs, but the industry where you've done a lot of work at the local level and you would like to see them recognized for the work that they've done. This is a great opportunity to do it. So thank you very much.
The preceding was produced by the National Center for Pavement Preservation. More information can be found on the web at pavementpreservation.org. Additional support provided by Michigan State University.